tonight's webinar. We welcome Nathan Archer back to hear his report from Leeds University on the impact of COVID. If you have managed to read Gwendolyn's newsletter, she reminded us that these are tough times. I'm sure you don't need to be reminded, you experience it every day, but it's also always useful to know what the research says, because it underpins whatever discussions or arguments you may have with local authority or explanations for parents. And it is for this reason that we have invited Nathan back to share with us the findings of his research. So welcome, and over to you, Nathan.
Thanks, Barbara, and thanks to you and Gwendolyn too for the invitation to come back and join the group. Evening, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to join you. For those of you who I didn't meet last time, by way of introduction, my name's Nathan Archer. I'm a researcher based at Leeds Beckett University at the Montessori Institute. And just to confuse matters, I'm going to be talking this evening about a project that I did at the University of Leeds. So this is about the impact of COVID on early years settings. So I'll just get my slides up. Hopefully you can all see that on the full screen. Yep, great. Okay, so the title of the presentation is the Early Years in Crisis, Evidence from Nurseries in England and Wales. But just before I start with these slides, I just wanted to add a couple of caveats to the presentation. So first of all, just to make it clear that the focus of the presentation is very much on the impact of COVID on settings, so on the operations of nurseries and preschools and childminding settings, rather than the impact on children's learning and development. But if anyone's interested in studies around that focus of children's learning, then I can certainly provide some links for you later on. Just to say also, you'll have seen at the top of this slide that the base for the study was the Leeds University Business School, which perhaps seems a little bit unorthodox for a study on early years. Just by way of background, this study started before I joined the group and was initiated by these colleagues who you can see, the names of whom you can see on the slide. Apart from myself and Katie Cruz, all of these academics are specialists in employment relations, so workforce development, work legislation, etc. And they turned their attention to the early years. So they're very much rooted in the work of the business school. Katie Cruz is a socio-legal expert, so she's an expert in legislation around the workforce. And then I was the lone early educator on the team. So it made for quite an interesting dynamic between education and this kind of employment relations, but just to give you a little bit of background to the team. I should also add a caveat as well that some of the findings are, to say the least, a little bit gloomy. I'm sure many of what I present to you this evening will be familiar to you if you're working in early years settings. Obviously, we have to report what we find, but I should just add that warning that it is slightly dispiriting to say the least. But what I've tried to do is end the presentation with a couple of slides that look beyond the UK at the kind of initiatives and policies that are being implemented in other nations, and maybe there's some hope and inspiration that we can take from those examples. Okay, so over the course of the next few minutes, what I'd like to do is offer you a little bit of background to the project and some policy context as well. But I'll not dwell too long on that, because obviously many of you are working in settings and be more than familiar with the context in England. Then we've got some findings from the surveys that we conducted, quantitative findings, so some statistics that I'll share with you. And then qualitative findings. So I was more involved in the interviews with nursery managers and early educators and childminders. So I'll share with you some of the words from those interviews that I argue are probably more powerful than some of the statistics. And then we'll pull those together and think about what the conclusions are and some of those policy implications for the sector going forward. So, by way of background to the project, it goes without saying that Covid-19 put significant demands upon early childhood education and care across England and Wales. And we found that it had exacerbated many of the existing inequalities and weaknesses within the system. So many of you will be familiar with the ongoing challenges around funding, around support for children with special educational needs, around recruitment and workforce development. And we felt that COVID exacerbated many of those challenges. So it's well known that the provision has been underfunded for a number of years and undervalued. And we particularly honed in on this issue of the underfunding of the so-called free places for 2, 3 and 4-year-olds. And in particular, it became apparent that many settings are having to increase fees on non-funded places, non-funded hours, to compensate for that underfunding. But as a result of that, we found that some settings were unaffordable for some families. And as a result of that, the access to those places was unequal. We also found that for educators, and it says they're 95% of whom are women, and I actually think it's slightly higher than that, educators had been classed as essential during the pandemic, but not treated as such. So in terms of wages, of reliance on statutory sick pay, and you may remember being excluded from government support in terms of access to PPE and funding around cleaning, those kind of issues. Those are all very prominent in the conversations that we had with colleagues in the sector. So for us, this raised many questions about how the sector was navigating those disruptions and what it meant for the safety and sustainability of the sector as well. And I'll try and sort of highlight some of those responses. So the work of the study itself was divided into 4 work packages, and this evening I want to focus in particular on the group-based provision. So this is data from nursery managers and early educators working in group-based provision. But we also spoke with childminders and nannies, with grandparents and parents, and then also undertook some international policy comparisons as well. So I'll touch on those at the end. And it was quite a large-scale study as well, so 2 waves of longitudinal data. In the first, which was between January and March 2021, if we can remember that far back, we undertook 4 surveys and had 3,000 respondents to those surveys, so we were very happy with that response. And then 185 in-depth interviews in wave 1, and I think there was probably around 100 in wave 2. So we went back to the same participants in the autumn of 2021. So just by way of policy context, again, as I say, you'd be more than familiar with this, but we were reflecting on the impact of the 30 hours of free early education for 3 and 4-year-olds, and the way that there are earning limits on that, both the sort of lower threshold and the upper income threshold there means that that's only accessible to parents earning within those income thresholds. But also the 15 hours of free early education for the most disadvantaged 2-year-olds as well was part of the picture that we analysed. And then if anyone is working in a Welsh context, you'll be familiar with Flying Start. For those of you who are not familiar with that, this is a targeted programme for birth to 3-year-olds living in the most disadvantaged areas of Wales. So this is a sort of funded childcare and parent support programme in the most disadvantaged areas of Wales. And then the tax-free childcare, which supports with the payment of fees. So some of the statistics that I wanted to share with you, on this graph here, you can see on the left-hand side, we have numbers of children attending, and on the right-hand axis is the percentage of settings that were open. And the timeline along the bottom goes from the beginning of the pandemic, April 20, through to June 2021. So you can then see the blue line is reflective of the number of children that were attending settings. So that obviously goes from around 80,000 up to 900,000. And then the orange line is the percentage of settings that were open over that same period. So you can see, as you might expect, a reflection in the numbers of children attending, dips and rises in accordance with settings being open. And those dips and rises are reflective of various lockdowns and reopenings, and an increase in the number of COVID cases as well. So this was a breakdown of the survey sample that we undertook with nursery managers or group-based setting managers. And you can see the spread there across the private day nurseries, the voluntary preschools, those schools which had nursery classes, and local authority maintained nursery schools and independent schools. This is broadly reflective of the percentage makeup of that group-based provision across the country. So there's a total there of 821 survey responses from group-based settings. So this reflects the occupancy rates depending on the type of provision. So the purple bar, for example, are those settings or the percentage that saw a decrease in occupancy rates. So pre-COVID, the average occupancy rate was between 75 and 90% of those settings that we surveyed. And then you can see that quite significant drop by December of that first year of the pandemic down to, on average, 70%. And then there's a further breakdown there by type of setting. So you can see that it's the private nurseries and local authorities nurseries that saw the greatest decrease in occupancy. And then if we look at that same sort of idea really of the decrease in attendance by areas of disadvantage. So if you're not familiar with the way that disadvantage is often measured, there's an index of multiple deprivation, which is used to gauge, it's used on various domains around child health, housing, crime, etc. And so each setting will be categorized into deciles or 1 of 10 categories by from the most deprived to the least deprived. So if we take the axis along the bottom, you can see that's about the proportion, sorry, the axis across the bottom is the indices of multiple deprivation. No, sorry, I got that wrong. At the side is indices of multiple deprivation, and along the bottom is the proportion of those settings that saw any change in attendance. So you can see the highest decrease is on the most disadvantaged areas, if that makes sense. So the purple bar along the bottom is the most disadvantaged area with the biggest decrease in attendance. Okay. And then we turn to pandemic-related deficits. So this is around the funding and the income for each of these types of settings. So overall, 41% of settings reported going into deficit because of the pandemic. 33% broke even and 7% made a profit. And again, you can see that differentiation by type of setting, with local authority nurseries experiencing the greatest proportion of deficits. And then independent schools, private preschools, voluntary preschools, down to private day nurseries. So quite a startling statistic, really, 41% of settings in deficit as a result. Quite shocking, really. And then in terms of what those settings did to remain afloat and to sort of balance the books, you can see a range of answers there, from taking on additional debt, using reserves, and then changing staff contracts, whether that's not renewing temporary staff or making permanent cuts to staff. And we've categorized those by whether the setting was in deficit or not. So you can see the highest proportion of those settings that were in deficit at 50+% used reserves, but then beyond that they were taking on staff and making changes to staff contracts. So again, quite significant measures having to be taken there in really difficult circumstances. And now we just move on to look at the uptake in those funded entitlements. So first of all, this is a change in the uptake of the 15-hour entitlement for the most disadvantaged 2-year-olds. And you can see there in the red bars where there's a decrease. And that's quite significant. That's over 50% decrease in the local authority nurseries that we spoke to. Now, we know already that only 2/3 of children who are eligible for these entitlements are accessing them. So clearly a further decline during the pandemic is quite troubling, really. And you can see that decrease, or indeed where it stayed the same across those other settings. So interesting to note that preschool nursery classes, the proportion broadly stayed the same. And this is just a further breakdown by those deciles of deprivation that I talked about. So interestingly here, you can see the highest decrease in children eligible for that entitlement accessing it was in the most disadvantaged areas. So again, quite troubling really that some of those children will have been sort of off the radar in terms of accessing their provision and additional support that they might have needed. If we look at the same sort of or similar statistics for 3- and 4-year-olds, you can see a slightly different story here in that there was a fairly level decrease across types of provision. So although a significant decrease of sort of 35%, it was very similar across day nurseries, preschools and local authority nurseries, but nonetheless a significant decrease during that period. Okay, so I'll move on to some of the qualitative data now, and these are drawn from the interviews that we undertook with 38 nursery managers and 44 early educators. We were sampling participants from these areas: Wales, West Yorkshire, London and the Bristol area. And we did that because we wanted to sort of reflect a diversity of areas, both rural and urban, north and south of the country, and also where the breadth of provision could be accessed. So the participants reflected those working in single sites as well as some of the large chains, where they were working in provision that was private, but it might also have been, there might have been charity provision or social enterprise, sole trader provision. And also that, as I say, it reflected those different socioeconomic status within those different areas. So the first finding that we drew, perhaps unsurprisingly, were concerns about the financial sustainability of the setting. So this manager of a private preschool in London said that our earlier setting is in crisis in terms of funding, and COVID is probably pushing a lot of settings over the edge. Another in Wales says we've got no funds coming in at all. We looked at this month in January, we had £8,000 coming in, but this January we've taken £250. And then the head of a maintained nursery school in London, the bottom quote, suggests that she would like the government to pay an increase in the payment per child on roll to reflect the increase in the other payments that we've had to pay. And that hasn't risen since 2011. I'm sure that will be familiar to lots of people on the call. And then in terms of sustainability as well, we also wanted to reflect a very key theme coming through about the intensification of work. And this will be, again, all too familiar to people listening, both as managers and as educators working in settings. This nursery chain manager in West Yorkshire was quite an unbelievable story, really. But she was suggesting that there were times where she'd worked a 20-hour day because she was having to deal with the test results coming in at all times of the day, but to sort of try and enable the continuation of the service. And she was even working on Christmas Day to try and manage that for reopening after their week of closure. And similarly, this manager at a private preschool said that, you know, being responsible for health and safety of children and staff was a real threat, and the responsibility of that was huge. Everyone expects you to have the answers. And then another point that we really wanted to drive home in our findings and recommendations to policymakers was about a workforce feeling undervalued, really. This particular educator in the top quote there had been working for 34 years and she was still continuing to earn the minimum wage, sadly. She very much enjoyed the work that she was doing, but she says, I wish I'd made some money along the way. If we just go down to the bottom there, I think this manager of a group of charity preschools in West Yorkshire summed it up when she described the tension between what she wanted to be able to pay the staff team and what the funding allowed her to do. And that was a story that we heard time and time again in interviews. Another finding that we reflected on as a team really was lack of recognition, and I was just talking to Barbara about this, really, about the sort of systemic and broader societal lack of recognition of the early years sector. But what really struck us through the COVID pandemic was the way in which the early education element of what was provided to children and families was unrecognised, and there was very much a talk of childcare for key workers, for critical workers, and to enable parents to return to work. But in all of that, the early education for the child seemed to be diminished, certainly in the policy texts and discourse. So the second quote there from an early educator in London said, I don't think they realise just what we're doing or what we have to do. I don't even think that schools really realise what we have to put in and what's expected of us and how much we teach the children. And the third quote there reflects on what an important job it is to nurture children, to provide them with the skills they need to be ready for school and to thrive. I don't think that education starts when they walk into a school. So there's lots to reflect on there, and again, I apologise that is so dispiriting, but I think it reflects a very common feeling across most of the participants that we spoke to in the study. The conclusions that we've drawn from both the qualitative and the quantitative data are that settings have experienced a decline in the numbers of children attending and decreased occupancy rates, and many of them have moved into a very precarious financial situation. We also know, and we've underscored what many of the membership organisations have talked about in terms of the difference between the cost of offering early education and the funding received to make that happen. And then I've just reflected on the undervaluing of early education and care through the pandemic, the complexity and intensity of that work, the lack of recognition of education, and the challenges around pay and pay progression, really. But I did want to offer some hope, as I suggest, some sort of optimism, because I think if we look to other nations, if we lift our eyes and look internationally, there are all kinds of examples where other countries have responded to the COVID pandemic quite differently. And I think we should draw some strength from that, but also use that in our lobbying to government and to policymakers about what can happen and what can be done. So these are just some examples from Ireland. Anyone familiar with the Ireland context will know that they've invested quite a substantial amount of funding in a new strategy for under fives, and that also involves a change to the funding system. So much of the funding is now going direct to early years settings rather than through parents in the way that we have tax credits, for example. The funding is going direct to the setting, and that also is enabling settings to address the pay issue in Ireland at the moment. But the plan also involves an aspiration to achieve a graduate-led workforce by 2028, with funding to assist that pathway. That also comes with a new career framework to build on those sort of various steps and levels towards that graduate workforce. And there's also a commitment to leadership and management skills training as well. And the idea that there'll be this central hub for career development to sort of raise the profile of the sector and try and support recruitment as well. And if we look a little bit further afield to Australia, they've also committed to a 10-year strategy for the education and care workforce starting this year. They are also looking to investigate options to improve pay and conditions. They're planning a registration system for early educators as a form of professional recognition. They're aspiring to introduce teacher mentor and induction support. And interestingly, a communications program to promote the value of early education more broadly to society. And then finally, there's the viability that they're exploring of well-being support as well, which I think is really timely on the back of the COVID pandemic, and something that I think we certainly need to explore in the UK as well. So that's a whistle-stop tour through the report. There are all sorts of other findings in there that you're obviously welcome to explore if you want to. It's available online. There are also some more international case studies in there as well. So we drew on work going on in Scotland and in Wales as well to look at how they're responding to COVID. And that also makes quite interesting comparisons with the response in England as well. So please do have a dip into that online if you're interested in exploring that further. And I hope that's been insightful. I'm sorry it's not the happiest of findings, but I am happy to answer any questions or hear your reflections on it.
Thanks very much, Nathan. As you said, you invite people to ask questions or put comments into chat. What surprised me hugely is how people coped with the rising costs of the pandemic, and what large proportion of settings actually used reserves. So that demonstrates the commitment of the leaders and managers. They believe that what they are providing for children is really, really important. So they are prepared to use, in a way, something that should have benefited them for the benefit of the children. I thought this has happened because majority of the workforce is women. If it was men, it would not have worked in the same way. They would have done their business plan and their SWOT analysis before they committed, whereas women went with their hearts. So thank you everybody who did that. I think that's
indeed.
important. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a core infrastructure service, isn't it, and should be treated as such, I think. But yeah, as you say, that speaks volumes about the commitments of those leaders, indeed.
And it also reflects the fact that the work of women is never valued as much as the work of men. They feel that we are pushover, we can, they will cope with it, they will find a way. Which I have always found extremely irritating, but it is true that's how it works.
Indeed. I'm not sure the other phases of the education sector would have been treated quite the same way.
Well, they were not, because the majority of the provision is either in the state sector or in the independent sector, and they operate on very different funding model. Schools have been given a lot of support, really, in comparison to the early years, and the independent schools continued to charge their full fees. Which those of you who have got children in private schools will know that was the situation. So they sustained themselves by simply passing it on to the parents. And I think that the saddest part of this report is that the earliest provision, which should be available to all children, has become more and more expensive. In some cases, if you have got a nursery setting within an independent school, the nursery costs more money than the provision for the children in the primary school, which, again, reflects the cost of high quality provision. Yeah,
indeed.
I wonder if our participants wanted to share some thoughts or ideas or reflections or their experiences. Hannah.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Nathan. I didn't really have a reflection. I just had a question, really. Thank you for sharing the study. I think you've highlighted again in sharp focus what all of us know here, that we're pretty undervalued, that we're poorly paid, that we work long hours, but we do get to hang out with 2-, 3-, and 4-year-olds, which for me is where the excitement is. And I've had a lovely day today doing exactly that. But I wondered, when you showed the slide about changes that had to be made, about how you felt we might be able to recruit more people to a sector that you just established is quite difficult to work in, let alone recruit new people too. And I wondered if in your conversations with managers, anyone had any ideas, or you discussed that with people.
That's a good question, and really timely as well, because I know lots of people are struggling with recruitment at the moment, aren't they? I guess it was at a time where people were trying to stay afloat, and they were seeing a number of their colleagues leave for better paid work. And for me, this still comes back to the underfunding issue, because until government fund those funded hours at the appropriate rate, leaders and managers like yourself will struggle to remunerate the team in the way that they want to, and the level that they want to. So I'm afraid I don't have any kind of great answers around that one, really, because I think this is really key to it, that this kind of undervaluing. So until government address that funding issue, and I know the membership bodies have been lobbying long and hard about this and continue to, until that's dealt with, it will be an ongoing struggle, really. I think, many settings are trying to differentiate themselves. The Montessori ethos, for example, is an important approach to that, really, when you're trying to recruit from a limited pool, and obviously ongoing professional development as well is something that came through in the survey, but that in itself comes at a cost to the setting. So I'm sorry, no easy answers on that one, really. It feels to me like bigger systemic issues around funding need to be addressed. Yeah.
Thank you. I think, it just feels like the situation hasn't moved on that much, with or without COVID, and, if you've got any ideas of how we can go about changing that, it'd be interesting to hear your views, because obviously this is something that affects us all.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, I don't know if you're involved in the all-party parliamentary group on early education and care. I know they have the ear of some of the MPs. It's an ongoing challenge, but it's one of those avenues where I think there's a sort of growing solidarity and a growing movement around the issue. And we just have to find those platforms, really, to raise our voices and make ourselves heard, I guess, as best we can.
I mean, the one thing is that this is not a problem unique to the UK. Despite the underfunding, it is a universal problem of the importance of early years growing, but people not really appreciating that the person who works with young children has to be the most qualified person, because you have to be a jack of all trades. You have to be specialist in so many fields, plus be patient, all sorts of qualities and characteristics of the early years person, and need to have a deep commitment to the children to be able to return every day with smiling face.
Indeed.
But Hannah, I often think that combining employment with opportunity to study and grow as a person is probably a costly but very, very important way how the early years sector could address some of its need for staff, because there are still a lot of people who would be interested in working with young children if they could see it as an opportunity to get qualified. And and what Collaborative Montessori does is providing the professional development for people, which is also very, very important to share expertise.
Thank you. Yes, let's hope so.
Marian, do you want to reflect on your question that you put in the chat, the financial vulnerability of settings?
Yeah, yes. I mean, you said there, Barbara, you know, the job that we do is very varied. And of course, you've got so many hats on. And I do agree with Hannah in that it is one of the most rewarding careers that you can get into. However, you know, you are faced every day with a different challenge, a different set of circumstances. And of course, within every setting, there has to be somebody who is financially astute. So you wear so many different hats. And I think many settings did close. I mean, around us, I'm in Farnham in Surrey, and around us, it was almost like constantly you heard of well-established good settings that just couldn't continue, and not just through the pandemic. The aftermath of the pandemic had its effect. We're still not up to the sort of occupancy rates that means that we're sustainable. And I've always made sure with my financial background that we have a future and we are sustainable. So for settings that don't have that expertise, that's really hard, especially when you can see that they are offering so many wonderful things for young children. I think I'm that my cup is half full. Anyone that knows me will know that. But I worry because there's so many other pressures. It's almost like a train coming along, or the waves at the sea. You know, you just feel that you've managed to put your head above water and everything's coming together slowly, but you can see it. And then something else hits you. You know, the increased costs with heating and electricity, not necessarily for you as a business, but the impact on parents means that they will question whether or not they can afford the additional costs, because we're not allowed to charge top-up fees. But in Surrey, we have a term that we use that basically is top-up fees, but it's a fancy word that we're not allowed to say those other words. But basically, that's the only way we can survive. And we're very honest and upfront about it in terms of saying, you know, if we charge what we get from the government, we close within a year. So if you want us to be here, this is the cost. But how are our customers, the parents, going to be able to afford that when they're continually hit with rising costs for heating and electricity? You know, we do offer privately bursaries to children from areas of deprivation, but that comes at a cost to the business. And I can't do that if it means if I'm not getting sufficient numbers in. So, you know, you've got this mixed match. I'm currently involved with the DFE project where they're trying to help settings in deprivation use training to support staff and put mentors, and they call us experts. It's a peculiar term, but there you go. There's so much money being spent on this project. Whilst I'm involved in it, I have to highlight it and say, it's a wonderful thing, it's good, it's going to help. But could it not be done in a more cost-effective manner? I would say. You know, I'm not going to bite the hand that feeds me because the DFE are paying me. So I think it's a wonderful thing, and it will help lots of children and lots of settings. But it's an enormous amount of money being spent. Could that money be used more cost effectively? I don't know. That was my little bit. Anyway, sorry, I'm ranting and raving, and, you know, I'm passionate about it, as many people are. And we will get there, but I don't know. I can honestly say it's the first time in 30 years that I've actually thought, I don't know if we're going to survive this. Am I going to be in business in 5 years' time? I don't know. I really don't know.
And it's very short, looking very short term. It's not planning for when you are ready to give it up.
Yeah, no, it's whether or not we'll survive rather than me taking a backward step and going on holidays to the Bahamas or something. Fat chance. I'm a childcare educator.
Yes.
We can dream.
Brighton's about the closest I'm going to get. Anyway.
Well, let's hope the sun will continue to shine for the next few days so that you can make Brighton.
Brighton at least. Thank you, Barbara. I'm sorry if I've ranted a little.
No, I think you have expressed the view of many people who have joined us today, or people who will listen to the recording, the constant worry of how to make your business financially sustainable, so you could not only provide for the children, but also to express some kind of appreciation and value to the people with whom you have worked, because good settings would have sustained their workforce. They would have worked together to create a team, and with all, they will all be hit by increases in cost of living too. And they will begin to think, well, if I have to drive to work, I might be better off not to drive to work.
Yeah, sure.
So not very positive outcome of our discussion. I really, really apologize. We were hoping to bring you some more positive outlook, but at the same time, as Hannah said, I hope you will wake up tomorrow morning and you will think, it is hard, but my heart will melt when I see the children come and play in the garden, or explore some of the Montessori materials, or sit together with a book, or create something in the creative area. That always reminds us why the job is important, and how much we have to learn from children and how much we have to share with them. So I hope you will go forward to the rest of the term with these thoughts, rather than the worry of what September will bring. Because
Barbara, just to say, I agree so much with you. And every day when you go into the setting and there's a little face looking at you, and just a gem or two when they say something like, Mrs. Meakin, you're my friend, and that's what keeps us going, isn't it? That's our fuel.
Yeah, or if you see them doing something totally unexpected and you think, how has that child thought about this? How, this kind of uniqueness of the children's mind. So as we part, I will once again share a little morsel from my grannying experiences. Our Fionn, who is now 5, is very much explosion into writing, and she loves writing, and she wanted to write labels for my new plants. And she wanted one of the, those thin labels that you do with permanent pen. It was having the permanent pen was very important element of the writing. And I said, so I have got chili peppers. I've got one plant of that, and I have got 5 plants that are the same. They are crassula. So she said, don't worry, I know how to do chili peppers. And in her transcription of phonics, she managed to do pepper chili. And then the crassula was more challenging, but as the new phonics teach you all sorts of blends, she was able to manage it. But she realized it's rather long, boring words to write. So because there were 5 of those plants, she wrote 1 label, and then on another label, she wrote 5. So she is at the beginning of multiplication without any suggestion from an adult. And I was in 7th heaven to be able to witness this. So I hope you will be able to witness some wonderful things as you go in the classroom tomorrow. And thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week as we have Anna Maria Gild sharing her experiences of working with babies and toddlers. And she has got love for this age group like I don't know anybody else who loves them as much as that. So please join us to learn from Anna Maria next week. Thank you, everybody.